Uh, okay. Um, okay, I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If Russia is in such dire straits that their population just like can't support themselves anymore, and that's the case, then they're not going to have the resources to be putting troops on the border. There must be something else to that here, and escalating this is not going to be in anyone's interests. So what do we stand for? We stand for NATO not pushing and inflaming tensions. We don't stand for creating a self-fulfilling prophecy in Eastern Europe that has gone on throughout the ages, throughout history, whereby escalation leads to escalation, pushing Russia into the conditions that a conflict is inevitable, pushing Russia into a corner, so they must respond. So 3 things in this speech. Firstly, why this manufactures the exact circumstances that forces Russia's hand into a conflict. 2 points here. Firstly, let's look and analyze Putin. Putin's brand of brinkmanship and positioning throughout his tenure and leadership relies on power, it relies on aggression, it relies on strength, and that means aggression and strength against the Western world. It means constantly being in conflict. It means constantly having an adversarial relationship. This looks like, at the moment, having thousands of troops already right over the border, ready to invade at the closest thing you can get to an invasion without actually having an invasion. So, so if we push Putin to be, if we do any sort of expansion into Eastern Europe with NATO and allow anything more, given the current state of already troops on the border, we do not give Putin any room to move to be more aggressive. This will be seen as a response to Putin's putting troops on the border. And the only option when you've already got troops on the border to expand further is to literally cross the border in an invasion. And this is something that Putin would be prepared to do. We've seen him annex the Ukraine in the past and still have the Ukraine annexed. Putin will cross the border if pushed, if given the conditions to do so. There is no alternative. There's no more interim steps before doing this. Secondly, Putin already sees, and Putin's supporters already see the Russian-speaking population as part of them anyway, and culturally part of them anyway. So there's no reason that they will not attack. They already have that incentive to attack. Secondly, on China and what this means in the revival of the Sino-Soviet era partnership. So an expansion will create a situation down the track into Eastern Europe where eventually have direct open conflict with China, or even if it's not direct conflict with China, it means there's going to be economic vulnerability when China gets involved and China feels threatened. Russia already has China as a key strategic asset on their side and a key partnership on their side. And we have seen China is not afraid to engage with countries using economic means when they feel threatened, and they will do this. We've seen it with Australia and New Zealand. We will see it with European countries if they do this. So at the end of this, what are the impacts of this? First of all, at a minimum, it slows Europe's economic recovery from the pandemic, both with China's immense power as a major trading partner of the European bloc, but also with Russia, with countries such as Germany, with the Nord 2 gas pipeline and other mineral resources. We secondly see that the impact of this is just the Ukraine gets invaded if you push Putin to that point. We've already seen that the troops are on the border. Putin has nowhere else to go. And therefore, the only option if pushed further is to actually invade. So secondly, what is the alternatives and what are the better alternatives for regional security? And this is really simple. Why the US will protect the Ukraine without the Ukraine or any other Eastern European countries actually being a member of NATO under the status quo, and why this is so important. So look at the situation in domestic US politics at the moment. Biden has just massively stuffed up Afghanistan and is polling incredibly poorly domestically because of that. The midterm elections are coming up and the Democrats are facing predictions of a 10-year wipeout. The Democratic Party is on the nose and they have to do something to improve their international relations and get a win domestically politically. Further, the Republicans, since the Obama era, have been criticizing Obama and also Biden, who was part of that Obama administration, for being too soft on Russia and not doing enough. So what does this mean? Biden needs a policy win. Biden needs to show strength on the international stage and has publicly committed to defending Ukraine should Russia escalate further and actually invade. Biden has to follow through on this public support, because to not do so would be politically disastrous in the US, given the upcoming US elections. So Biden needs to follow through with this support. And the Democrats will support Biden because they, facing the midterm elections, need a political win as well. And the Republicans, after criticizing Democrats for the past 15 years for not being hard enough on Russia, will support it well, because this is a unifying issue. The Republicans are happy to move into a conflict and exert American power. So we see that America, because of the unique political situation at the moment and the unique tension at the moment, will move in to support any Eastern European country that is threatened, because they need to domestically have a political win. So what do we see at this point in the debate? We've shown you that if any country or NATO is open to any Eastern European country and accepts any further European countries joining NATO, then that creates the conditions for an escalation to an actual invasion in the Ukraine, or if not an actual invasion, then at least severe economic consequences. Secondly, though, we see that even short of that, economic consequences, but also we show that even if an invasion is inevitable on either side, the Ukraine still has the immense military power of the US that will come deployed and will protect Ukraine. Furthermore, though, Russia knows that Biden and knows all this analysis that I've given you about why Biden is likely to respond. Russia and Putin know this as well, which is therefore, and in and of itself, a very powerful deterrent. Finally, let's look at the role of Turkey in this debate. We know that Turkey wants to get more involved in Europe and join NATO and looking to join NATO. Why does this mean that Turkey is more likely to be join NATO, and why is this a bad thing? Firstly, because it will give Erdogan performance legitimacy as achieving a large foreign policy goal. Gives his administration the legitimacy being accepted into an large international treaty. But secondly, it means that if NATO wants to do any action anywhere in the world, but specifically in the Middle East, they must now consult with Turkey, and this is something that NATO strategically does not want to be held beholden to. For all these reasons, for the escalation, the likely war, we are so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker, for your final remarks. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue on his case. Here.
There's a bit of a tension in the OG's characterization of what is likely to occur. So on one hand, Shermae says towards the end of her speech that the support for Ukraine membership into NATO is at an all-time high, because presumably the threat of Russia is seen to be quite material and quite legit, quite valid in terms of its actual threat level. On the other hand, at the start of her speech, in response to KIDA's analysis, her argument is Russia is decimated right now. There is no growth, so the calculus will be objective, and therefore it will mean that Russia has absolutely no capacity to take over. It's unclear why the benefit that she gets at the end of her speech through that argument is necessarily something that occurs, given that she has already or rather characterized at the start of the speech that Russia somehow doesn't actually want to follow through with this particular threat. So at the end of the day, I'm not very sure what the OG's benefit is at benefit. But what I want to point out here is that they don't actually engage with the clash on posturing and whether or not it's a real threat quite comprehensively in the way that I think Peter tried to do in his speech. What did Peter told you? Peter told you that Putin's considerations are threefold. First, the branding politically for him within his party and how much he badly wants to unite his party that has hardliners that are basically breathing down his neck for his incompetence at handling the economy as rightly characterized by the opening government. The second thing is that he needs to care about rallying his ultra-nationalist voter support base in the face of growing opposition political popularity, especially again in the wake of economic mismanagement, but also in the wake of all the sorts of things that are happening with like the leader of opposition basically being engaged in a high-profile failed assassination attempt, right? But thirdly, Russia, like as a general consideration that in his political calculus, Russians see the Russian-speaking population as in Ukraine as part of Russia. So I want to make it very clear here that they are very likely to basically go ahead and do this anyway. They'll probably do some sort of invasion to basically posture. The question is, to what extent are they going to follow through and maybe take over Ukraine? Perhaps the reasonable answer in this debate is they're probably not going to take over the entirety of Ukraine. Rightly so pointed out that there's a limitation there. But what I want to point out here is that that's not the point. The point here is that they have to engage with the fact that there are alternatives to that regional security, even if they were prepared to follow through with that particular action of invading Ukraine. And I think that's where Peter's arguments were ignored. Because Peter gave you 4 structural reasons as to why the US will get involved as an alternative, even if NATO doesn't. Firstly, he told you that the Democrats are going into the midterm elections, and currently, with the kind of economic mismanagement and the kind of lethargy seen in the US economy, it's not likely that they'll do well. They need a political distraction to unify and rejuvenate their voter base. But secondly, I think he tells you quite clearly that Biden is trying to distance himself from the inaction of Obama's administration's inaction. So I think what we want to be very clear about here is that if anything, precisely because of what happened in Crimea, that's the reason why Biden will actually do anything about what's happening in the Ukraine if it gets to that level. But thirdly, we think that Biden's failures in Afghanistan necessarily mean that he needs that foreign policy victory to give his presidency some legitimacy to go into the 2024 election without losing to Trump again. But lastly, we told you that Biden's voter base is lethargic. We told you that his voter base is lethargic, and it means that it threatens the very economic recovery that the US and Europe needs in terms of building up relationships again, because that means that for probably Trump gets re-elected into power, and then you see all that trade protectionism that hits the world hard again in 2024. That's the reason why we think at the end of the day, there's a long-term economic consideration on Biden's political calculus, not just as a political incentive, but as a general long-term economic calculation. I think it's something that has relatively been proven very well in Peter's speech as to why the US will be likely to get involved, whether or not NATO chooses to get involved or not. But more importantly, it is because of that rise of that Sino-Soviet partnership that Peter tells you about, that also acts as an additional structural reason as to why you are likely to see that continuing involvement of US projection of influence into that particular region. So the question at the end of the opening up of this debate was whether or not Russia's posturing was a credible threat or not. Their response to all this in Shermay's speech was to say, no, it's not a credible threat because there's no economic, because there's on an objective economic calculus, they are not actually able to do so and follow through. But that's not the argument that came out from the OO. The OO's contribution is debate winning because OO actually explains that the decision isn't based on an objective calculus. It is based on a selfish political calculus of a brinksman known as Putin. And it is precisely because Putin sees his self-preservation as a politician as being the most important thing on his calculus, and that he needs to do all the things like rally his ultra-nationalist voter base and to secure and unify his party, and also to prevent further growing opposition politician popularity in his own country, that we told you that it is very likely that that political calculus doesn't tend towards being an objective calculation, but a selfish political calculation. Before I move on, yes, CG.
Okay, so if the United States is going to get involved in Ukraine anyways, won't Kremlin still see this as Western intervention and become a triggering point to invade Ukraine?
No. So the point here is we don't want Western Europe to become someone that gets harmed by that particular partnership as well. So the point here is that China has a lot of ties with with Eastern European states right now in the EU. They're trying to rebuild Eastern Europe in the wake of the economic devastation. The point here is the eastward extension of NATO pulls them into direct economic conflict at the very least, as economic leverage is being used against like China against like NATO, for example. They get hit as well. So the point here is that if you want the European Union as a middling power to continue to grow, so that you are able to reduce the bipolarity of the world that the world is currently moving towards, you probably should not drag in that particular. The whole point here is that we want to minimize that polarization. We want to minimize the international relations division that currently exists. So the point here is, yes, it could occur. Like Shermay rightly points out, there are many thousand reasons why this Sino-Soviet thing will continue to happen. But the point here is we do that mitigation work to tell you that this is one thing that will be likely to accelerate it significantly further, and also entangle the Eastern European states like Hungary into a conflict that they do not consent to. How does this interact with the principle of sovereignty and military alliance that these guys on the government bench put in Shermay's speech? I want to point out here that DPM's claim about security alliances being one of the biggest projections of your sovereignty as a state is not logically prior to the idea of securing your economic benefit as the Eastern European state, or like to minimize the sort of economic risks to your country, precisely because your economic sovereignty and your ability to make trade is the precursor for you to do things like defend yourself as a country by investing in the military, or for example, rebuilding your economy so that you're able to engage in international trade. It is for those reasons we think that OO has won the opening half.
Hello, my name is Luigi. Good afternoon, everyone. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him, they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. I will watch the chat for all of your POIs. All right. Gracefully, I will begin my speech in a moment. All right, 3, 2, 1, and go. Shakespeare once said, "The world is a stage and all of us mere actors and mortals." What he forgot to mention is that the world is also full of producers, executives, and different managers, and it is more complex than that. Our case is extraordinarily simple in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, from closing opposition, that it is not within the incentives of NATO member states themselves to sustain a protracted eastward expansion and stalemate, and thus this state of uncertainty that you are putting Eastern Europe into right now will be bad for all states, particularly for the Eastern European states that are involved. Before that, a few points of response. So again, against closing government is boxed out of this debate. They have an argument on democracy in Eastern Europe. I want to be clear as to why they are boxed out. Their argument was they want to pursue democracy in Eastern Europe, even if Ukraine is sacrificed. Why would you sacrifice Ukraine? Ukraine, again, as opening, I agree with them. They're the most vulnerable actors of this debate because they're the ones in a high tension conflict or potentially conflict area, and therefore should be the priority of NATO and other military security alliances. Number two, just empirically, the last time I checked the map, and this is a meme response, by the way, but you can still credit it if you want to, eastward expansion is towards Ukraine, which is the far most one that is most vulnerable because it's proximity to Russia. And if they care about countries like, what is this, Slovakia and Serbia, that is to the south of Poland, and therefore are not as important as those other countries that are involved in this debate. So again, there's not much military problems happening there. I think there are already democracies in the status quo, or if you're talking about weak states, then give them development aid. You don't have to give a military security alliance or to make sure that you have to put military bases there in many of these places. But the last response I want to make is this: the pursuit of democracy is not as important as the pursuit of stability and the protection of lives in many of these areas, which is why we think a de-escalation of military expansion is more important, and it is better for many of these individuals in these places. And the last thing I just want to note against this other response: why would Russia join NATO if NATO is created as a military security alliance against Russia? All right, let me go to the argument. The first argument I want to explain now is why internal disagreements within NATO will make this eastward expansion unsustainable and a failure. And this is the most important argument in this debate. So opening opposition, to their credit, make a lot of arguments as to why the intervention of the US and the intervention of Russia in Ukraine is going to be bad. But again, this is all worst case scenario. Opening opposition just says Ukraine is GG and is going to be invaded. But I will talk about the most realistic argument in this debate about the hesitancy and stalemate that is likely going to occur and why this protracted long-term conflict is going to be worse for many of these actors. There are many reasons as to why a protracted military defense expansion is not in the interest of particular NATO member states. Number one, even if the US promises through and pursues this funding, many countries such as Germany, France, and the UK are already strongly invested and reliant on Russian oil and natural gas. This is how you use the matter on Nord Stream pipelines. Germany in particular already gets oil already from Russia through the first Nord Stream and second Nord Stream pipelines that is already in construction right now. It's a direct pipeline created to bypass Ukraine to go directly to Germany and to Russia. There are many reasons that they are indebted to one another, and there are many reasons as to why the ability for them to buy in to eastward expansion and fund it more and more, especially to the point that Ukraine will actually need it in the future when a conflict arises, is going to be unsustainable and become more and more unlikely. The reason as to why this is important is because it becomes harder and harder for you to be able to manage this conflict when it is necessary, or manage it when when it is not necessary. Because you can't de-escalate once you've already committed, right? Once you've already made this pronouncement, it becomes harder to de-escalate it after like longer through this negotiation. Number two, there are legitimate reasons for the US to not overspend on this conflict for reasons such as domestic citizens significantly do not care about foreign funding on NATO. Like that is why it was popular for Trump to pull out of NATO and to defund it, because he could spend it on other things like social welfare. And thirdly, the longer this conflict takes, more resources are spent on both sides. It's more expensive for NATO relative to Russia because Russia's already proximate and they already have bases nearby and different housing nearby, and they already have Crimea and control over there, while NATO has to spend many months bringing more and more security forces and many of these places to all these other places. Again, OG's gonna POI and say I'm contradicting OO because OO said US will intervene no matter what and it's GG for everyone. Again, I want to be realistic. This is an even if argument. Even if the most realistic scenario happens wherein it becomes a hesitant situation, the implication of this argument is simple. The guaranteed impact, the guaranteed argument is the state of uncertainty that is caused in Eastern Europe, whether Ukraine allies with Russia or allies with Germany, they lose on both sides because of eastward expansion conducted by NATO. Again, so this House supports debate, neutral observer, objective actor imposed onto these individuals. They're the most vulnerable actors, and therefore the economic opportunities that are taken away from Ukraine and Belarus for opportunities and investments they would otherwise want to be in the region are pulled out. There's more political protests that may more likely ensue. Investments from other regions would also pull out because of the fact of a military conflict that is likely to ensue in the future, and therefore most of this becomes more and more violent and becomes more and more unstable to be able to control these countries. And you cannot guarantee that with Western expansionism. You cannot guarantee that because of the uncertain alliance that exists within NATO and how fragile NATO already is. Again, I don't need to give more structural reasons that I've already given, because as Shermay said, it's already an empirical fact that NATO's alliance is already becoming more and more fragile. Let me get a POI from OG. Let's go.
Luigi, I don't really care whether or not you're knifing the OO, but don't you think that if Ukraine increasingly submits to Russian pressure without the eastward expansion, the sanctions that exist for Russia and the rest of the world is going to be similarly economically devastating for them?
Oh no, so again, the model OO said was in terms of de-escalation. Let me be clear on that. And therefore, our argument is, in the worst case, if Russian occupation in Ukraine happens, and the sanctions are likely going to be taken away because you're de-escalating this conflict in this process and de-escalating military expansion, it is good for Ukrainian citizens and Belarusian citizens in the future in Eastern Europe. And the simple reason for that is there are incentives for Russia to pursue stability in this area. Number one, there are political incentives to avoid further conflict internally in this area. That's what happened with Belarus when they were able to put in Lukashenko and avoid certain protests that would happen when you had a pro-Russian candidate that was already put forward. You were able to stir, at least for a very short period, many of the protests that could ensue in the future because people cared more about their jobs than their political aspirations for democracy, for example. But number two, the interconnectedness of economies in the region is a good to take advantage of for Russia. So they don't want to make sure that this place will go into fires or erupt into more and more violence. So for these reasons, there are incentives to invest in this region and therefore become more stable. That's good for everyone. I'm very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker, for your final remarks. Now I'd like to invite the government whip to close government share here.
Great. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. POIs in chat, please. With that said, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. First thing I'm going to point out about Ukraine and why CEO's attempt of taking down CG's case was insufficient. And secondly, I'm just going to talk about the long term, because that's something that all other three teams have never been engaging with. The first thing I want to do with Ukraine, and the problem with CEO's response saying that like Ukraine is really important, is that we agree, but we're saying that even in the worst case scenario, we're still going to prove that we're able to win, even if we disregard Ukraine. But we still like uniquely did provide enough mechanisms to talk about why Ukraine is sufficiently going to be okay. We take the tipping point because the opening bench was basically in a deadlock. OG says that Russia is harmed by COVID and Russia is unlikely to be belligerent. We don't know the number of troops there. And then OO comes up here and says that there's still people on the ground. It's likely to be bloody. The problem we see is that it's still ambiguous to the extent of whether Ukraine is actually going to be invaded and what the magnitude of harm it is. We take the tipping point because we take the opposition at their best. Firstly, we prove to you that even if Ukraine got invaded, and Russia had an active incentive of killing everyone in Ukraine, it's likely to end coinciding. Insofar as the United States, according to O's logic, is likely the fact that you're literally going to get killed by all these kind of tanks. But CO comes up and says that United States is not going to enter. If that's the case, I still don't understand why Russia will necessarily be aggravated anyways. But secondly, we also nullify the argument insofar as even if Russia does invade Ukraine, what is actually likely to happen? I do not think if Russia wants to integrate Ukraine with Russia, they're going to have an active incentive of literally mass murdering all casualties. I think the most likely scenario that CG is providing is probably kind of surrendering. The fact that Prime Minister is just going to be like, okay, if you're going to come onto our borders, like you could pretty much like try to declare dependence over Ukraine. And at that point, I don't really understand the whole idea of civilians like dying on the farm. Insofar as there's still probably a number of moderate Ukrainian people that aren't necessarily going to be opposing, insofar as they're not going to get killed anyways. So it's unlikely that the harms that opposition wants to talk about Ukraine is so important. That's why I really want you to take my member's case, because we provided you enough mechanisms in weighing about why caring about other democratic transitions into countries like Slovakia and other Eastern Europe nations is more significant insofar as they have more dire situations where there necessarily needs to be in a state of economic interdependence, where people still are necessarily suppressed by things like freedom of speech. And those things are more significant harms than the kind of speculative arguments that OO and CO want to bring. Therefore, even in terms of Ukraine, we already proved to you that it's unlikely to materialize to a massive harm. And even if it does, we think it's going to be okay for what I'm just about to suggest. And given that, I'm going to transition into my whole idea of the future, and other like rebuttals to CO will be integrated. But before I do that, I'll take a...
In democracies, we care about self-determination as a concept, and this is translated into the broader idea of sovereignty. So if your side stands for the principle of democracy, your side can't also just throw Ukraine's sovereignty under the bus by saying that their self-determination as a country just does not matter for the greater goal of self-determination and democracy in other places.
Okay, honestly, I don't really understand your point, because what we're saying is that even if Russia does invade Ukraine and there's a principle that like in violation of sovereignty, like, and the fact that the United States, if that's the case, is probably like likely to invade, like it's always historically done as a global superpower, just likely to unnecessarily, Russia is either gonna lose immediately or they're rather not gonna like kill anyway. So we're just saying there's no kind of objective harm that's likely to happen. I don't really understand why everyone is fixated on Ukraine so much. Therefore, let's talk about the long term. And before I just want to do that, I just want to point out like CO's entire premise was based on this idea that no other country wants this kind of democratic transition insofar as there's economic interdependence. The unique thing coming from CG is the whole idea that even if that is true, you still necessarily need certain democracies. You need economic interdependence. You need free enterprises. You need economies to be open insofar as you're able to do that. And if that's especially if Germany is still relying on economic trade with countries like Russia, it's also unlikely that Russia is going to basically be aggravated in opposition to do whatever, because there's still going to be some economic interdependence. Anyways, what do we bring to you? The first thing we provided to you in the long term is that it's unlikely for Russia to become so aggravated. Insofar, even internally in Russia, there's already huge pro-democratic movements. The fact that the leader of the opposition party was nearly assassinated, as OO said, is crucially what was igniting like any kind of like anti-Putin movements right now to basically say we need democracy, because it's a principal violation of these parties or elections to be manipulated of things like assassinations. The fact that other countries like Germany is coming in. But crucially, we also provided you unique mechanisms about how in the long term, even when Putin dies because of things like old age, and the fact that he's already not doing anything about COVID and he's basically lying in a bunker, crucially means that any kind of like successor, as we pointed out, and the fact that probably is likely to be the Minister of Defense, insofar as that's the person that has the most connections, that's basically doing the most active deals, they already have an active incentive to trade and basically cooperate with the United States, because they've realized that the current economic system of Russia is already failing. That's a crucial mechanism that CO really needed to engage with. Because if this is true, as we provided you, it's heavily likely, it's unlikely that Russia is going to continue this whole idea of like dictatorship and autocracy, while they're likely to do NATO. The last thing I want to do, even in terms of talking about CO's case, was like, okay, but NATO was basically made to like oppose Russia. The first thing I want to point out here is that this is untrue, is that NATO has historically continued to make compromises because they still recognize Russia. That's why we still had joint operation forces, even when it comes to Yugoslavia or Syria anyways. So that crucially means that it's still possible for our side to NATO to make compromises, and especially when they know that Russia is likely to become more immediate on our side because of the fact that, you know, like they're not going to invade military if there is going to be a successor, if it's the fact that Putin might die in the near future. Given that fact, we would argue that it's much better on our side especially caring about the long term for a couple of reasons. The first thing is because the vast majority of members that used to come, and not the basic big countries, we're talking about United States, we're talking about the small countries like Moldova or Slovakia, they uniquely came in as an investment of their future, but they wanted to assure that there's going to be regional stability. They uniquely cared about the fact that they wanted they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to be invaded in the long term. They have an active incentive of entering NATO for the long term of making sure there's going to be economic interdependence in the whole world. That's why it's more important to care about the long term insofar as Ukraine, even at the expense of Ukraine, and assuming that Ukraine is literally obliterated, that comes at the expense of neglecting them. Because the counterfactual opposition isn't likely to be like China just goes brr, but it's likely to be it's likely to be a very problematic world where Russia is continuing to expand power because they know that there aren't enough anti-military forces to oppose it. They're likely to entrench things like Soviet Union, treat insofar as they know they're aren't going to be opposed, and because NATO is actively retreating all its kind of democratic principles, which uniquely means that NATO continues to lose power anyways insofar as that happens. That's why you should care about it long term, because we proved to you that's more important of an incentive compared to whatever CEO says. So even if stability is important, democracy is important, because democracy is what gives you economic independence. It's what gives you self-determination of things like freedom of speech instead of simply living a mundane, stable life. You need these kind of active acknowledgements of human rights on our side. For all those structural reasons, we take this debate.
Thank you, Speaker, for the final remarks. Now, to close today's debate, I'd like to call upon the opposition witness.
Okay. I do not have POI preference, and I would like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We believe the closing opposition has won this whole debate and has a better case than all of the rest of the 3 teams in today's debate. Let me prove you from this on, right? So, firstly, why opposition has won government side. So, firstly, why opposition wins open government. So what the open government mainly told you is about how the Russia is trying to take away Ukraine currently, and how it is NATO's role to solve Ukraine for the situation, right? So we believe that firstly, it is really uncertain to do that for NATO, and secondly, there would be a war attrition, and this would lead to a stalemate that would take a very long time, not being really efficient in this case, right? So there are a lot of harms that NATO gets, and it's basically the reason why we opposed it, right? So, and secondly, why closing opposition wins opening opposition, right? So the opening opposition basically told you that Russia would invade Ukraine, and the US would defend against Russia, and how that gives a bad effect, right? So we told you about how the government side's case provides uncertainty for NATO, and since Russia is economically strong, and the country members of NATO would have a divided opinion on whether they would support or not support Russia. We believe that we won the opening opposition, since they were under the assumption that US would defend Russia, and portray that what will happen. That is not 100% true in this debate, right? So, but what we argued, what we argued in this debate is not. It's only about the about the economic parts, not mattering on whether the U.S. Will support Russia or not mattering on the portrayal of the situation that the opening half has made, right? So what the opening opposition gave you is a really narrow-sided case. While we gave you a scenario that affects more stakeholders in today's debate, right? So moving on to the reason why closing opposition means closing government. So as I told you previously, what closing opposition came up and told you is about the pursuit of democracy in Eastern Europe.
Is it just me, or I can't hear the speaker, right? All right, speaker, can you hear me? All right, thank you. Hello, speaker. It seems that you are disconnected. I think I paused you at the 1 minute 50 something mark. So yeah,
Oh, really?
you can start then.
I didn't know and continued my speech. So can I know where I stopped at?
All right, so it was about 1 minute 55 seconds for me.
Until what kind of content did you hear from me? Like, I'm not sure when I got disconnected.
So it was on the
Okay.
part of, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So continuing my speech. Wait. Okay. So continuing my speech, let me move on to the reason why closing opposition means closing government, right? So, what closing opposition came up with and told you is about the pursuit of democracy in the Eastern Europe. So our response to this is that democracy here is not that important, since the pursuit of stability or the protection of lives in these high tension areas is more important in this debate. So, like, renewable stakeholders like Ukraine and Belarus, as our member of opposition told you, already significantly rely on the Russian economy, right? So, eastward's expansion helps the ability for them to take advantage of these economic investments, since military are really uncertain. So like on whether they would make it more difficult for them to, and that would make them feel more difficult to stabilize. So even though we assume that their case is a really good and acceptable case, so the closing government did not give us a clear respond to our side's case, which we can only assume that they're simply agreeing to our side's case, and therefore we win against closing government side, and therefore we have to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all speakers for the wonderful debate. Yep, so we'll come back after just discussion, announce the results at the main hall. So thank you all debaters for the great round.